On the evening of January 9th, 2010, 34-year-old Jarmeka Whitehead, whose friends all called her Nikki, spooned coleslaw onto a platter and watched as guests began to filter into her home, which was located just outside of Atlanta, Georgia, in a gated community. Standing by the front door greeting the guests were Nikki's 16-year-old twin daughters, Jazz and Taz. Nikki had been nervous about hosting this party tonight, but so far, everything was going well. She'd made a fish fry, and her whole family had come and brought even more food. She had worked all day at the hair salon where she was a beautician, but she'd still had some time to decorate and hang up handwritten posters that read, "Taz and Jazz, welcome home, we love you." Now, Taz was here laughing it up with her family, and it made Nikki really happy. But as she looked around, she realized that Jazz was nowhere to be seen. Nikki frowned. This party was really supposed to be a celebration of forgiveness and new beginnings, but there was still a lot of hurt to get over in their little family. Because for the last year and a half, Taz and Jazz had not been living at home with Nikki. Nikki had lost custody of her kids after the three of them got into a huge fight and Nikki called the police. She had thought that calling the police would just scare the girls into behaving better, but that's not what happened. Instead, a judge decided that Nikki was not a fit parent and sent the girls to go live with Nikki's grandmother, Della Frazier. Nikki had been heartbroken. She herself had come from a tough background, and she had tried so hard to break the cycle for her kids. She had actually been raised by Della, who was her grandmother and so her daughter's great-grandmother, because when she was born, her own mom was in jail. And also, Nikki had gotten pregnant with the twin girls when she was just 18 years old. But when the girls were born, Nikki had decided that she would not let them make the same mistakes that she had. Instead, Nikki had tried to raise them with strict rules and to focus on academics. And so, Taz and Jazz became Girl Scouts, they did dance and music classes, and they made the honor roll at school. Until they became teenagers, everyone always said how sweet and well-behaved they were. But when they hit 13 years old, they began sneaking out and getting into fights, and nothing Nikki did seemed to rein them in. When Nikki finally lost custody of her kids to her grandmother Della, she had worried she might never get her girls back. But she had done a lot of hard work, including enrolling in college classes, and finally, she had regained custody and her girls were home, living with her and her boyfriend, Robert Head. Now, everything was not perfect at this point. The girls were very clingy to each other, and they openly said they missed Della, their great-grandmother. But for tonight, Nikki felt like, on the whole, things were pretty good. Except that one of the girls, Jazz, seemed to have disappeared from the party already. Nikki went and found her best friend and asked her to go look for Jazz. Her friend nodded and then slipped away, and Nikki waited nervously by the food for her friend to come back. And only a few minutes later, the friend returned with some good news. She said that Jazz was in her bedroom and was a bit overwhelmed by everything, but they had had a nice conversation about how excited everybody was to have them home. Nikki's friend said that both the girls seemed to be in good spirits, so Nikki should just relax and eat and enjoy the party. At this, Nikki felt a wave of relief wash over her. Then she went back to setting up the fish fry. 3 nights later, on January 12th at about 10:30 p.m., Nikki walked out of her evening class at the local college where she was studying to be a fashion designer and got into her car. It had been a bad day. All the happiness she had felt at the girls' welcome home party was now gone. But this time, it was not because of a fight she had had with the girls. Instead, it was because she and her boyfriend, Robert, had had a nasty argument that afternoon. Nikki and Robert had been together for a decade, and they really loved each other. But their relationship was a little unconventional. Part of it was that Robert was 30 years older than Nikki, and he worked as a long-haul trucker, so he was away from home for days or even weeks at a time. But none of that is what made their relationship truly unusual. What made it really atypical was that their relationship was open, meaning Nikki was allowed to have other boyfriends besides Robert. And this was ultimately what their fight that day had been about. According to the rules they had set up for their relationship, when Robert was home, they were an exclusive couple. But when Robert was away working, Nikki could date anybody she wanted. But Nikki was not supposed to talk to Robert about her other boyfriends. But this morning, she had taken a call from a man named Joe Carter, who she was dating, right in front of Robert. And Robert had been furious and insulted, and Nikki had left to come to class without resolving that fight. Now, all she really wanted to do was go home and relax and just be by herself. And she knew Robert had left on a trucking trip, and the girls were very likely asleep right now. But she couldn't just go home and do that. because the reason her other boyfriend, Joe Carter, had called her that morning was to ask her to come over to his house after her class. So Nikki shook off her exhaustion and drove to Joe's house and rang the bell, hoping that whatever Joe wanted, it would be quick. When Joe answered the door, he looked very serious. He invited Nikki inside, but he seemed incredibly tense and awkward. Nikki had a bad feeling, and she asked Joe what was wrong. But at first, he wouldn't even answer her directly. He just kept talking about old fights they'd had. Nikki had already had a long and emotionally draining day, so she told Joe that whatever was on his mind, he just needed to spit it out. So, Joe told her. He wanted to break up. He was done being part of her open relationship. Nikki was absolutely incredulous. Joe had made her come all the way out here late at night after class after all this just to break up with her? And also, just weeks after her daughters had finally come home? Like, this is supposed to be a good time in her life, and he's just crushing her? Nikki just stormed out of Joe's apartment and slammed the door behind her. The next day, January 13th, a little before 3:30 p.m., Nikki's twin daughters, Taz and Jazz, got home from school. They walked down Appaloosa Way and turned into the walkway of their home. When they got to the door, Jazz took out her keys and unlocked it. She pushed the door open and stepped in ahead of Taz. And as Jazz did this, she began to scream. Because the entire entryway was covered with blood. There was a trail of it leading into the house. They screamed out for their mother, but they got no answer. And so perhaps against their better judgment, they decided to go in and check on her. And so they followed the trail of blood that brought them all the way to the master bedroom. And when they looked into the master bathroom, they just stood there in silence before turning and bolting out of the house. A Rockdale County Sheriff's deputy was driving his cruiser down Appaloosa Way on his way back to the station after serving a warrant at one of the houses in the neighborhood when he saw two teenage girls sprinting towards his car at full speed. The deputy slammed on his brakes as the girls reached his cruiser and began banging on the windows. They were completely hysterical and screaming incoherently, and when the deputy got out of his cruiser, it took him a second to get them to calm down enough to tell him what was going on. But when they finally did, he radioed back to the station to request backup. About 30 minutes later, around 4 p.m., Detective Ken Swift of the Conyers Police Department stood inside the master bathroom of Nikki Whitehead's home on Appaloosa Way, looking down at Nikki's dead body, partially submerged under the water in the jacuzzi-style tub. This was the bloodiest crime scene that Swift had ever been to. The whole house had a stifling metallic smell from the sheer amount of blood that was soaked into the carpets and smeared all over the walls. Whatever had happened here, Swift could tell it had been long and very violent. The house was trashed. Chairs were tipped over, there were all these jagged pieces of something red and ceramic scattered in the living room, and the floor was littered with magazines that had been knocked off a coffee table. Now, Swift tried to count the number of stab wounds on his victim's body, but it was impossible. This level of brutality suggested pure rage, which meant that Nikki had very likely known her killer. The fact that there was no sign of forced entry or anything stolen also supported this theory. Swift put on a pair of gloves and then bent down to gently touch Nikki's head. He could see lots of stab wounds in the back and front of her neck, and there was a strand of hair between her teeth. Swift asked a crime scene tech to take the hair for analysis. Then he stood up and followed the bloody drag marks back out of the bathroom and down the hallway. He found a bloody handprint on a door frame of the master bedroom and also on the doorknob of the front door. There were some bloody footprints of bare feet that officers had discovered outside that suggested that someone, very likely Nikki, had actually run out of the house during the attack, but had either turned around or, if it was Nikki, been dragged back inside. Swift stood at the front doorway looking out at those bloody footprints and also the sea of police vehicles with their flashing blue lights on. He was hopeful that a neighborhood canvass would turn up witnesses. This was, after all, a very safe and very quiet area. Someone running outside covered in blood was sure to attract attention. As he surveyed the scene, his eyes settled on two teenage girls standing on the front lawn with blankets draped over their backs. They were both visibly shaking with sobs and standing close together, and one of them had her arms up over her face. But as Swift watched, he realized that the girl with her arms up wasn't just crying. She was actually also biting her arm, with a look of pure anguish on her face. Now, Swift knew these girls were the victim's daughters, and he also knew they were the ones who found the body. And so, based on what he was seeing, it seemed like they had to be in shock. He was about to walk over to them and offer some words of comfort when a police captain actually intercepted him and just let him know that he had already arranged for the girls to be transported to the station. And so Swift decided he would talk to the girls there. About an hour later, Detective Swift was standing in the police station looking at a TV monitor that showed a live feed of the conference room, where the captain had put Jazz and Taz Whitehead. The girls had calmed down a little bit, but they were still rocking back and forth and obviously crying. By now, the officers had finished canvassing Nikki Whitehead's neighborhood, and shockingly, no one had seen anything. One neighbor reported hearing his doorbell ring in the morning and someone yelling, but he hadn't gotten out of bed to answer it. The only potentially useful information the police had gotten from neighbors was that they had seen a black car they didn't recognize parked on the street near Nikki's house around the time of the murder. But this was not a lot to go on. Until they got forensics back, Swift knew that Taz and Jazz Whitehead were his best hope for any leads. However, they were so distraught he didn't know what he would get out of an interview. But when Swift walked into the conference room, the girls appeared to try to pull themselves together, and Taz told Jazz they had to be strong. Swift put a box of tissues on the table and then gently asked the girls if they could walk him through what had happened. The girls took a minute to compose themselves, and then they began to speak. They told the detective that the day before, their mother had gotten into a bad argument with her boyfriend Robert. But they hadn't really resolved it, and then she had left for class and he had left for work. The girls said that night they stayed up late at their house, but they were in one of their bedrooms talking with each other, so when their mom came home, they didn't hear her. And then that morning, they had overslept and missed the bus. But they ended up walking to school because when they knocked on their mother's door, she didn't answer. The girls said at the time they hadn't thought much of it, and when they left the house, everything looked and seemed normal. They just hadn't seen their mom yet. But when they got home, of course, it had been a different story. The house was ransacked, there was blood everywhere, and when they tried to call out for their mother and she didn't call back, they wound up searching the house, and they would ultimately find her dead inside the tub. At this point, the girls began to break down and start crying again, like they were reliving the moment they found their mother. And to Swift, this made sense. But really what he was thinking about was the part of the story where the girls referenced a fight between Nikki and her boyfriend Robert. The police had been trying to reach Robert ever since they found Nikki's body, but he was on the road in his semi-truck and they hadn't yet been able to track him down. And in a murder investigation, the victim's romantic partner was always the first suspect, especially when they were not getting along, and according to the girls, that's exactly what was happening right before Nikki had died. However, when Swift asked the girls if Robert and their mom fought often, Taz and Jazz were adamant that they didn't. They said they loved Robert, and so did their mom. Their biological father had not been in their lives, and Robert had really helped to raise them, taking them for rides in his truck and out to eat at McDonald's. He was great. So, Swift asked the twins if there was anybody else they could think of in their mother's life who maybe she wasn't getting along with or who might have wanted to do her harm. And it was at this point that Taz and Jazz brought up Joe Carter. The girls said their mom did really love Robert, but she talked to a lot of other men. And the one name the girls had been hearing a lot recently was Joe Carter, who was their mother's other boyfriend. Now, the way Taz and Jazz brought up this other boyfriend was very casual, like it was totally normal in their lives. But when Swift heard it, he immediately knew he had a compelling motive for Nikki's murder by either Robert or Joe, a love triangle. Detective Swift left the twins in the conference room and walked out of the police station to his cruiser. He couldn't question Nikki's primary boyfriend, Robert, until he could find him. But the twins had told him that Nikki's secondary boyfriend, Joe Carter, worked at a barbershop right next to Nikki's salon, and that was only about a 20-minute drive away from the station. Swift figured that if he hurried, he could catch Joe before his shop closed up for the day. He drove over, and when he stepped into the barbershop, a little bell on the door jingled. Everyone inside the shop reflexively glanced to see who had come in, and Swift cleared his throat and asked if a Joe Carter was around. When one of the barbers gestured that that was him, Swift asked him to step outside. Swift studied Joe's face carefully as he made this request, looking for any sign of nervousness, but Joe just looked confused. He told the customer whose hair he was cutting that he'd be right back, and then followed Swift out onto the sidewalk. Once they were outside, Joe immediately took out a pack of cigarettes and offered one to Swift, but Swift shook his head and said no. Joe seemed relaxed and friendly, and like he had genuinely no idea why Swift might be there. So, based on that, Swift decided to just be direct. He told Joe that he had some terrible news. His girlfriend, Nikki Whitehead, had been murdered that morning, and so he needed to know where Joe had been last night. Immediately, Joe began to weep so hard he couldn't even answer the question. And then when he caught his breath, he just tried to light a cigarette, but his hands were shaking too hard to make the lighter even work. And then eventually, he told Swift that he just couldn't believe it. He said he had actually seen Nikki the night before, and she was fine. He admitted they had been having some problems. In fact, he had broken up with her the night before because Nikki had another relationship with another man, Robert. And this caught Swift totally off guard. Joe's reaction definitely seemed sincere, but what he was saying, that he had broken up with the victim less than 12 hours before her murder, essentially because he was jealous of another man, was incredibly incriminating. So Swift told Joe to show him his arms. The detective knew that a knife attack often caused injuries to the attacker as well as the victim, and he wanted to see if Joe had any wounds on his hands or arms. Swift felt a surge of adrenaline as Joe began to roll up his sleeves. But when Joe held out his arms and turned his hands up and then down again to show both sides, his skin was completely uninjured. Now, this was not proof that he was innocent, but it certainly did not make him a stronger suspect either. Joe told Swift he did have an alibi, at least for today. He said he'd been right here at work, which was 15 miles away from Nikki's house. All day long, this is where he was, and his coworkers and clients would all confirm it. With this, Swift was getting a sinking feeling that Joe might not be his guy. But to be thorough, he told him he was going to check on the video and also speak to his coworkers to confirm his alibi, and that Joe would have to come to the station to take a polygraph test. And Joe agreed. Then, right before Swift turned to leave, he remembered a detail from the canvas of Nikki's neighborhood: the unfamiliar black car one neighbor had seen right outside of Nikki's house. And so Swift paused for a second, and then he asked Joe what kind of car he drove. And Joe said he drove a black Toyota. Swift nodded and thanked Joe, and then walked back to his car to drive back to the station. Now, by this point, Joe was not his number one suspect anymore, but Joe had a black car, and also he didn't have an alibi for the night before when he saw Nikki until he showed up at the barbershop the next morning. There was a gap. And so Swift obviously could not rule him out. The following day was Thursday, January 14th, and Swift began the day at his desk, drinking a lukewarm cup of coffee and reading through a stack of papers. So far, he had one good theory about a love triangle that he thought was viable, but he also knew he wanted to keep an open mind about other possible ideas and suspects while he chased down the love triangle angle. The first packet of papers he was looking at were court documents from the ongoing custody case of Taz and Jazz over the last few years. From looking them over, Swift was quite interested to learn that the twins' great-grandmother, Della Fraser, who at one point had looked after the girls, had been very upset when Nikki had regained custody, at least in part because it meant Della would no longer receive money from the state for their care. Custody disputes and money were both reasons people killed each other. Swift knew this. But Della was 75 years old. Nikki's attacker would have had to be very strong with good stamina to stab Nikki that many times. So it didn't feel promising that Della was behind the murder. The second packet of papers that Swift was looking over that morning was the autopsy report. Nikki had been stabbed somewhere between 50 and 80 times, and her spinal cord had been severed. However, while that did give some information, it didn't really give Swift much more than he already knew. I mean, he just looked at the crime scene and knew this was a vicious attack, and the autopsy basically confirmed that. Finally, Swift had a few reports from the uniformed officers who had done the neighborhood canvass. They talked about the mysterious black car that had been spotted, that at this point Swift was thinking might belong to Joe Carter, the second boyfriend, but the uniformed officers also listed information about another mysterious car neighbors had seen. This one was a red sedan, specifically a Dodge Avenger, that had a white hood and missing hubcaps, and apparently it had shown up in the early afternoon outside of Nikki's house. No one saw the driver, and it only stayed for a few minutes. As Swift mulled over all this information he was taking in, the phone on his desk rang. When he answered, he was pleasantly surprised to hear the voice of Nikki's live-in boyfriend, Robert Head, the guy nobody could find. Robert apologized profusely for being so hard to reach and then asked, what's going on? When Swift told him that his girlfriend had been murdered, Robert let out this awful, anguished scream, and then he said he would head home right away. But Swift told him no, just come to the police station. Before Robert hung up, he said he had one more question. How were Taz and Jazz? To Swift, Robert's reaction to the news was fairly genuine, and his immediate concern for the girls did sound fatherly, which was how the girls had described him. But Swift also knew the man could be acting. When Robert arrived at the police station, Swift had him put in an interrogation room, where he watched for a few minutes on the surveillance camera before going inside himself. When Swift looked at Robert up close, he looked like a broken man. He was 64 years old and thin, and he was slumped in his seat looking absolutely miserable. When Swift sat down across from him, he could almost feel Robert's grief from the other side of the table. Robert would turn out to be a very easy interview. He answered all of Swift's questions clearly and fully, and didn't shy away from pretty embarrassing details. He said he knew about Joe Carter, and he didn't mind that Nikki was seeing him. Nikki was young and beautiful and outgoing, and Robert felt lucky that she even wanted to be with him at all. He said he was crazy about Nikki and about her girls, and really he just wanted her to be happy. He admitted to fighting with her the day before she was murdered over her phone call she took from Joe Carter right in front of him, sort of breaking one of their rules, but he said that as soon as he had left and hit the road in his truck, his anger had faded and he had considered their issue closed. And then when Swift told Robert to show him his arms, they were uninjured, just like Joe's. Finally, Robert's truck itself contained proof that he really could not have been the killer, because it had a GPS tracker inside, which put him a full day's drive away from the home by the time Nikki was killed. Swift ultimately left that interview feeling totally deflated. In a matter of just 24 hours, he'd identified two seemingly very good suspects in Robert and Joe. But now, both of those cases seemed to be falling apart. Over the next few days, Swift tracked down every lead he could, but every lead he had seemed to hit a dead end. The crime scene unit hadn't found the murder weapon, and the crime scene itself was so bloody that forensic DNA evidence would take months to process. Joe Carter, who was Nikki's second boyfriend, passed his lie detector test, which included discussions around his whereabouts the night before the murder after he had broken up with Nikki at his house. Also, his coworkers the next day at the barbershop confirmed that he had been there all day that day. And on top of that, given the strength of his alibi now, the black car that was seen outside of Nikki's basically couldn't have been his. So Joe was ruled out. Swift interviewed the twins' great-grandmother, Della Frazier, who had been very upset about giving the girls back to Nikki, but even though he didn't think that she literally committed the murder, she did in fact have an alibi for the day of the murder, so she was ruled out as well. Swift even tracked down that red Dodge Avenger with the white hood and missing hubcaps, only to find that it belonged to a hairdressing client of Nikki's who had stopped by Nikki's house after Nikki had missed her appointment. The woman had left when Nikki didn't answer the door. As the days turned to weeks, the case began to go cold. Meanwhile, Nikki was buried, and the people in the gated community where she had lived began locking their doors at night. The twins, Taz and Jazz, were living with Della again, and Nikki's whole family was pressing the police to come up with an answer. What happened to Nikki? But Swift, despite his best efforts, was running out of ideas. But finally, one day in mid-May of 2010, so almost 4 full months after Nikki's murder, Swift got his first piece of good news. He'd walked into the police station that morning to work on a different case altogether, but when he sat down at his desk, he found the forensic reports from Nikki's crime scene. All the blood that had been soaked into the carpet and smeared on the walls had finally been tested for DNA. So had the hair that Swift had found inside of Nikki's mouth. And the results were shocking. When Swift finished reading them, he stood up, walked out of the station, and drove his cruiser to a gas station that was right up the street from Nikki's house. He knew police had not pulled surveillance video from the station because it was too far from the crime scene to be useful, or so they thought. But now, based on the DNA evidence Swift had, he knew that this gas station might be his very best hope to solve the case. When he pulled into the gas station parking lot, he went inside and asked the attendant to speak to the manager. The teenager behind the counter ducked into a back room and then motioned Swift to follow him. Once inside, Swift could barely contain his eagerness as he introduced himself to the manager and then quickly asked if he still had the surveillance footage from the morning of January 13th. This was critical. Swift knew that even if the gas station did have working cameras, the odds of the footage being stored for months were low. But the owner sat down at his computer, clicked around a few files, and then turned to Swift and grinned. He hadn't gotten around to wiping the footage, so everything Swift needed was still here, right in his files. Swift told the manager what specific time frame to search for in the file, and then once the manager had done that, he hit play. And when Swift watched the footage, he knew exactly who had killed Nikki. Based on DNA evidence, surveillance footage, and interviews collected over the course of a 4-month investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Nikki Whitehead on the morning of January 13th, 2010. Nikki's killer was waiting for her in her own kitchen. Nikki heard the killer moving around from inside her bedroom and walked down the hallway to come see who it was. When she first saw the killer, who was there with an accomplice, Nikki actually was not afraid. She was just annoyed. She told the killer and their accomplice to explain themselves. Then, when they refused, she told them to get out of the house. And it was at that point that they attacked. They leapt onto Nikki's back and began to punch her over and over again. Nikki fought back, biting them, and in the struggle, she bit down on a strand of one of their hairs, which got caught in her teeth. The fight moved from the kitchen to the living room, where Nikki briefly broke free, but the killer picked up a red ceramic vase and threw it at Nikki's head. The vase shattered and Nikki staggered, and that's when the killer grabbed a steak knife from a block on the kitchen counter, and they lunged. They began stabbing Nikki over and over as Nikki screamed. Panicked and now severely injured, Nikki made one final desperate run for safety. She bolted out the front door of her house. And she made it out the front door and down her walkway all the way over to a neighbor's front door, where she rang the bell and began shouting out for help, but her neighbor didn't come. And before she could run to the next house, the killer and their accomplice rushed up behind her and dragged Nikki back inside of her own house without being seen. Back inside, the killer and the accomplice slammed the door shut and threw Nikki up against a wall, where Nikki's braids left a bloody print. Nikki stood for a moment and then crumpled to the floor. And without hesitating, the killer jumped on Nikki and stabbed her again, over and over, until she was dead. After that, the killer and the accomplice dragged Nikki's lifeless body down the hallway and into the bathroom. They ran the water in the tub and then heaved Nikki's body up and over the edge. It was done. They stood there for a minute, just staring down at their work. After that, they cleaned themselves up and then put on their backpacks, slipped out the front door, and began their walk to school. And one of the first buildings they would have to pass on their walk to school was the gas station. And that gas station would have a surveillance camera that would capture them walking 2 full hours later than what they would tell police. It would turn out Nikki's killers were her own 16-year-old twin daughters, Taz and Jazz Whitehead. The twins had told police that they didn't see their mother that morning, but that was a lie. They had gotten up late, and instead of going to school, they had been writing notes to each other and laughing in the kitchen when Nikki had woken up, come in, and asked why they weren't at school. Taz and Jazz were already furious to be back home. They didn't want to be there, they resented their mother and all her strict rules, and for whatever reason, that morning when their mom confronted them, it just felt like the final straw. And so they stabbed her to death, and then went to school like it was just another day. When they got home, they put on this big act of being distraught and horrified by the violent scene they themselves had created, and then ran outside to go tell police. But what the twins didn't realize was that during the vicious attack, one of them got a strand of their hair caught in Nikki's teeth, and then also their own blood mingled with Nikki's. Because Taz and Jazz were identical twins, the police were never actually able to pinpoint which of them did what, but it was very clear they were directly involved in the killing. Also, after this DNA report came back and Swift read it, it prompted him to go to that gas station, which he knew would have been along the walk to the girls' school. And he quickly discovered they had lied to him about what time they had actually walked to school. Also, it was later determined that some of those bite marks on the girls' bodies that police had originally assumed the girls had made themselves out of grief were actually made by their mother during the attack. But the final and perhaps most cold-blooded piece of evidence were the notes the girls had written to each other in their notebook on the morning of the murder. Literally, they wrote these right before they killed their mom. One twin wrote on the last page of the notebook, quote, "She don't care. She's selfish. She needs to go." And the other twin wrote their response, which was, quote, "That's what I think also. She gotta go ASAP." On May 21st, 2010, Taz and Jazz Whitehead were arrested for the murder of their mother, Nikki. They ultimately pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter and were sentenced to 30 years in prison. Both twins blamed Nikki for starting the fight and said that she actually attacked them. However, officials do not believe this account. Austin Harif was born on December 21st, 1996, to a dentist and a pharmacist. They lived in a beautiful home in Palm Beach County, Florida, which is not only one of the nicest and wealthiest places to live in Florida, but it is one of the nicest and wealthiest places to live in all of America. And that's why, as of 2021, there are 44 billionaires that call this paradise their home. In 2010, when Austin was 13 years old, his parents suddenly got divorced, and within the same calendar year, both of his parents had new girlfriends and boyfriends. Now, of course, this was a shock to Austin and to his 1 year younger sister Haley, but they both relatively quickly adjusted to their new normal. And that was in large part because the kids didn't move out. They stayed in the family home with their mom, and their father, he did move out, but he moved into a home that was very close by. About a year after the divorce, Austin began high school, and immediately he excelled. He was placed into all advanced classes, and within these advanced classes, Austin was consistently at the top of his class. Austin was also a big athletic guy. He was about 6 feet tall and weighed about 200 pounds. And so naturally, he played football for all 4 years he was in high school. And for 1 year, his sophomore year, he also wrestled. But despite his size and willingness to play these very rough physical sports, Austin was not an aggressive guy. In fact, his football coaches actually used to criticize him for not being aggressive enough. And on game days, they would try to make him mad in hopes that would inspire him to go out there and smash some people. But it really didn't work because Austin was Austin. He was just kind of a laid-back guy who was actually much more interested in helping people than smashing them. In fact, towards the end of high school, Austin became obsessed with trying to identify a career that would allow him to help the most people. And he was so passionate about this that when he spoke about it, a huge smile would kind of involuntarily appear on his face. And so because of this, and because of Austin's generally happy disposition, his father very lovingly began referring to him as the happy boy. Shortly before Austin's graduation in 2015, he received a letter in the mail from Florida State University, and it was informing him he had been accepted into their 4-year pre-med program. Austin had settled on medicine as being his intended career path to help the most people, and so being accepted into this very prestigious program was like a best case scenario. And so Austin and his family were elated, and that summer that followed his high school graduation was totally charmed. Austin was on cloud nine. He spent a lot of time with his family and his friends. And then finally, at the end of the summer, his family packed all of his stuff into the car and they drove 6 hours north to Tallahassee, where the Florida State campus was. They helped move him into his dorm, and then afterwards they gave him a big hug, said good luck, and they left. And I'm sure on their ride back, the family members thought to themselves, Austin is doing so great. He is not only ready for college, he is ready to be an adult. He's ready to live on his own and be responsible. And at the end of Austin's first year in college, that supposition about him ready to be an adult seemed to be accurate. Austin got excellent grades, he met a nice girlfriend, and even though he wasn't playing organized sports like football, he had found another athletic outlet in bodybuilding, and he had actually built a decent-sized social media presence around bodybuilding and fitness. But underneath all of this public success Austin was having that year, he was actually struggling a lot of the time. He just wasn't telling anyone. In a journal he kept, he documented a deep sense of inadequacy caused primarily from his sense that his peers didn't accept him. And so he would write endlessly about how if he could just stop being so shy and be more assertive and outgoing, that more people would embrace him and would like him and would accept him. Over the course of that year, Austin also started abusing different substances. Those included things like alcohol, marijuana, and Vyvanse. Vyvanse is a drug that is a stimulant, and it's used to treat people with attention deficit disorder. He also experimented with hallucinogenic drugs like acid and mushrooms, and he also tried MDMA, which is kind of like a cross between a stimulant and a hallucinogenic. And those are just the drugs that we are aware he was taking. It's entirely possible he was taking other drugs too. Regardless, Austin began oscillating between the high of whatever drug or combination of drugs he was on to the low of his sober mind, which was totally saturated with anxious and depressive thoughts. Before the end of the school year, Austin was secretly poised for a full-blown mental breakdown, and it seemed like he knew it was coming too. In the last month before the end of school, his internet search history is filled with questions like, I think I'm crazy, what do I do? And how do you know if you're crazy? And how to deal with obsessive thoughts? And do I need to sleep? And what happens if you don't sleep? It was clear he was starting to question his own sanity. When Austin finally returned back home from Florida State that summer, his family immediately noticed there was something wrong with Austin. Within a few days of being home, Austin had moved his bed from his bedroom down into the garage, claiming that the reason he did this was because the house was full of demons. At night, instead of sleeping, Austin would patrol the house. He would literally just walk all around the house all night, never stopping, and every 2 hours he would knock on the bedroom doors of his family members and loudly announce that he was guarding them from the demons in the house. Now, you can imagine how his family felt at the time. This was so unbelievably weird and totally out of character that they just didn't really know what to do. Even though it was obvious there was something wrong, they didn't jump into action. Instead, the only thing they did at first was to just start locking their bedroom doors at night to prevent Austin from coming inside during his nighttime patrols. But as the summer progressed and Austin continued to act totally weird with no explanation, his family began to become convinced that he must be on drugs, that is what would explain all of this totally strange behavior. And so when they confronted him about his drug use, he would admit that he was taking drugs, lots of different drugs, psychedelics, stimulants, you name it. He's taking all these drugs. And so naturally, his family latched on to his drug use as being the root cause of his very strange behavior. And so they focused their efforts almost exclusively on getting Austin clean again. But towards the end of the summer, Austin said he wasn't taking any drugs, but Austin was still acting totally crazy and unhinged. And so around mid-August, the family decided they had to utilize something called the Baker Act. Under the Baker Act, individuals in Florida who are suspected of severe mental illness can be detained for up to 72 hours at the behest of their loved ones. And during these 72 hours, this individual is thoroughly assessed to see what's going on with them. And then at the end of those 72 hours, they are given a treatment plan that their family is supposed to help them enact. But before the family could utilize the Baker Act, something horrific happened. On the morning of August 15th, one of Austin's very close friends, who he had known since second grade, said Austin just showed up at his house without calling ahead of time or letting him know, which was very uncharacteristic. And when this friend opened the door to see what Austin wanted, Austin just asked him, "What year was I born?" And so the friend says, 1996? And as soon as Austin heard this, he didn't give a reaction to it. He just turned around and he left. And so this longtime friend is looking at Austin walking away, wondering, what's going on with this guy? Is he high on drugs? Is he drunk? What was that? So the friend goes back inside his house and he's thinking to himself, what should I do? And so after a couple of minutes, he decides, I got to call Austin and make sure he's okay. So he calls Austin, Austin picks up, and it's unclear what they talked about on the phone, but the friend convinced Austin to come back to his house and to just spend the day with him. But really, the friend just wanted to make sure Austin was okay. And so Austin comes back to the friend's house, and then the two of them actually would leave the house and meet up with some of their other friends that were in town that summer, as well as meet up with Austin's sister. And so the group, they decide they're going to go to the beach for the day. And on their walk to the beach, Austin tells the group that he just needs to get something at his house and that he will meet them down at the water. And so at this point, the group believes Austin is just fine. So they say, okay, yep, we'll meet you down there. And so Austin breaks off. He goes to his house. And when he goes back to the beach and meets up with his group of friends again, he's changed his outfit. He was now wearing this very thick, large football jersey. He was wearing long sweatpants that were also very thick. He had on 2 wristwatches and he had on sunglasses. And so as he walks down onto the beach, his friends look up at him and it's super hot out and they're at the beach. So this is a totally weird outfit to have on. And immediately they start kind of giving him crap about his strange outfit choice. But Austin did not think it was funny at all. And at first he was quiet, but then he kind of lashed out and said, if you tell me I'm crazy, I will kill you. And at this, his friends did not give him any more crap. Everyone just said, okay, man, hey, didn't mean anything by it. Just giving you a hard time. No big deal. But Austin's like clearly worked up. And so his sister comes over to him and she's like, hey, calm down. It's okay. It's not a big deal. And during this conversation, Austin suddenly goes back to being normal again. And he turns to his sister and he says, I'm actually half horse and I'm immortal. And his sister's like, what? You really need to get professional help. You need to see a therapist or a psychologist or something. Something is wrong with you and it's been wrong all summer. You need to get help. Now, apparently, Austin actually responded to this very positively. And he said, I agree. There is something going on and I do need to get help. You're right. And so after that, Austin and the rest of the group, they stayed at the beach for several hours. And then in the evening time, Austin, his sister, and Austin's very close friend, who was the guy that saw Austin in the morning when he asked, what year was I born, they all said they had to leave. And so the trio, they leave the beach and they head to Duffy's, which was a restaurant in town. And they were going there to meet up with Austin's father and his father's girlfriend. And so as they're getting to this restaurant, they're walking along the sidewalk, they're nearing this restaurant, when suddenly Austin turns to his sister and says, hey, I need to test out my immortality. And he just turns away from her, away from the sidewalk, towards traffic, and just starts walking into traffic like he's going to let a car hit him to test his immortality. And so his sister immediately was able to grab him and pulled him back onto the sidewalk, and then basically stood on the left side of him, preventing him from running out into traffic, and kind of pushed him along up the sidewalk right up to the front door of this restaurant. And when they got there, Austin had stopped trying to walk out into traffic. He was acting normal again. And it was there that the trio met up with Austin's father and his father's girlfriend, and the 5 of them went into Duffy's restaurant. It was about 7:45 p.m. when they got inside, and they were very quickly sat in the very back of the restaurant in this booth. And so there was a CCTV camera that watched them while they were inside this building. And so they're sitting at this booth, and about 3 minutes after having sat down, Austin gets up and walks away from the booth and walks as if he's going towards the bathroom, but then stops, doesn't go to the bathroom, turns around and walks back towards the front of the building, and then walks out the front doors, just leaves the restaurant altogether. Now, it's unclear if the rest of his family saw him do this. It doesn't seem like they did, but just a minute later, Austin comes back inside the restaurant and just walks right back to his table and sits down like nothing had ever happened. Less than 10 minutes later, Austin would get up again from his table, except this time, instead of feigning going to the bathroom, he just walks straight from his table right out the front doors of the restaurant and disappears. A couple minutes later, Austin's mother, who was not at dinner with them, she was at her home, which happened to be nearby this restaurant, she was home when she heard the sound of someone coming into her house. And so she went around to see who it was, and she found her son, Austin, in her kitchen, drinking vegetable oil, and there was Parmesan cheese all over the counter that apparently he had been eating as well. And so she runs up to him and she grabs the vegetable oil and she puts it down and she tells him to stop, at which point Austin does stop. And then I guess Austin just went up to his room and he changed out of his clothes because perhaps he got oil all over his shirt. And then his mom just drove him back to the restaurant. And so she watched him get out of the car and she watched him go through the front door, and then she drove off. And so about 30 minutes after he left that second time, Austin walks through the front doors of the restaurant. He's got a different shirt on, different hat on, and he just walks to the back of the restaurant where his sister, his friend, and his father's girlfriend are, and he sits down like nothing had ever happened. At first, it looks like everyone at the table is just silent. But then Austin's father very clearly said something to Austin, and it seems kind of hostile. And it would turn out Austin's father, who loved his son, was just totally at a loss for what to do with him. And he said to Austin when he sat back down, "What is wrong with you?" And at this, Austin just stands up and presses his father's face back up against his seat, kind of pinning him there. And then at some point, he just lets go, he leaves the booth, and he walks right out of the restaurant for a third time. Austin's friend, who was eating with them, he got up and kind of chased after Austin, but he was about 30 seconds behind him, and so by the time he got outside, he didn't know where Austin went, and so he quickly came back in the restaurant. He told the rest of the group he didn't know where Austin was, and so at this point, Austin's father's girlfriend would actually call the police and report Austin missing. They knew he was totally unhinged, and they didn't know where he was going to go, if he was a threat to himself or someone else, and so they figured they should just tell the police and have the police go find him. About 4 miles away from this restaurant, 53-year-old Michelle Mishcon was sitting in her garage watching TV. Normally, she would be joined by her husband, 59-year-old John Stevens, but he was out walking their dog, so for the time being, Michelle was alone. The couple had been married for roughly 20 years, they had 3 kids together from previous marriages, and they were just totally in love with each other. That garage was like their happy place. That was basically like their living room. They loved having the door wide open so they could wave to neighbors and flag people down to have a drink with them or just chat with them. They were just known to be a very happy, loving couple that were fun to be around. And according to their kids, they had both recently retired. John retired from his landscaping company that he owned, and Michelle retired from her financial advisory job. And the two of them were apparently both just really excited about retirement life. They were excited to spend more time together and go out with their friends and go out fishing on their boat with their dog, and then also spend as much time as they could just lounging back in their garage. John and Michelle's neighbor across the street was a middle-aged man named Jeff Fisher. Jeff was fairly close with the couple. He would usually watch their dogs anytime they went away, and he would often go in their garage and have a drink and just kind of hang out with them. And so this particular night, he was over in his house and he was going to bed early. So he laid down in his bed, he's getting ready to go to sleep, when he hears some strange sounds coming from outside his window across the street over near John and Michelle's property. And so Jeff sits up in his bed and kind of strains his ears to see what it was that he heard. And as he's trying to listen for some faint sound, he suddenly hears a blood-curdling scream, a woman's scream, coming from across the street. And so Jeff instantly leapt into action. He jumped out of his bed, he ran downstairs, and he ran out his front door, and he looked across the street, and he saw this unknown man, some young man that was slamming the car door of Michelle's car that was parked in her driveway, and he begins walking up the driveway, and at the top of the driveway, Jeff sees Michelle is standing in the garage, and she looks totally terrified, and she's facing this unknown young man. And of course, this unknown young man was Austin Harris. Now, Jeff had no idea what was actually going on. All he knew was he heard this scream, which was probably Michelle, and he's looking out there and he's seeing a situation that just doesn't look good. And so instinctively, he decided he would just run across the street and make sure Michelle was okay. And if he had to, he would confront this unknown man, Austin. So Jeff begins running across his property, trying to get across the street to Michelle, but before he could even get across the street, he's looking up and he can see this guy, Austin, has grabbed Michelle and thrown her on the ground, and now he's on top of her and he's beating her. And so Jeff runs onto the driveway, and as he's going right up the driveway between the 2 cars that were parked there, Austin leaps off of Michelle. He turns around and he looks at Jeff and he says, "You don't want a part of this." And now Jeff, he's a pretty big guy, and so he's looking at Austin, and he knows that if he doesn't do anything, this guy is just going to continue pummeling poor Michelle, and he had no idea where John was, and so he ran up and kind of lunged at Austin, and as he did that, Austin swung and he hit Jeff right across the side of the head. But Jeff took the hit, he didn't fall down, he grabbed Austin by the collar and threw him as hard as he could to the ground, and Austin, he hit the pavement hard, face first. And so Jeff is looking at this guy, kind of thinking he's not going to get up, but as he's assessing the situation, watching Austin stand back up again, Jeff suddenly feels a blinding pain in his face, in the side of his head, in his neck, on his back, and he looks down and he sees blood all over his arms, it's everywhere, he's covered in blood. It would turn out Austin was carrying a knife. And so when he punched Jeff, that knife went into his face, it cut the side of his head, it cut his neck, and it cut his back. He had 5 different puncture points from that one swing. And so Jeff believed at the time this was a potentially fatal wound. He was worried perhaps his jugular had been struck and he was bleeding to death. And he's seeing Austin stand back up, coming right after him with this knife. And so Jeff decides their only chance is for him to run and call the police. And so he runs into Michelle's Michelle's property. He's thinking that he's kind of drawing this guy towards him away from Michelle. He runs into their property, kind of slams into all their doors. He goes out a back door, and then he loops around the property, and then he makes a run for it straight across the street to his house. Never once did he turn around to see if this guy was after him. He figured he was right behind him. He gets to his house, he runs inside, he locks the door, and then he calls 911.
Police and medical. Young man beating up a woman across the street.
Are either of them injured? Can you tell from where you are?
Yes, there's a girl laying on the ground. He beat her up. I ran over there. I'm bleeding profusely here at the moment.
Okay.
I don't know what happened.
Can you tell if she's conscious?
No, it does not appear so, no. I've been stabbed in the back. I'm bleeding pretty bad.
After the call is placed and Jeff is certain that help is on the way, he's barely conscious, but all he can remember thinking was, I hope this maniac, Austin, has abandoned his attack and just run off. Or, I hope John has come outside and he's helping his wife. But unfortunately, all Jeff could hear was the sound of Austin across the street making these loud, animalistic grunting sounds. And at the same time, he hears the sound of someone screaming at the top of their lungs. He doesn't even know if it's one person, if it's two people, if it's male, if it's female. All he hears is screams and grunting sounds. And then seconds later, the police show up. The following narrative is the account of the second responding officer, who we'll just call Dan, and the first responding officer we'll just call Kristen. And so Dan, he comes flying down the street, he's got his sirens on, and he pulls in right behind Kristen's cop car, which is parked right out in front of John and Michelle's property. Kristen is already running up the driveway, her gun is out, she's getting ready to engage somebody at the top of the driveway. And so Dan, he hops out of his car, he's got his hand on his gun, and as he turns to run up the driveway, his view is obscured. There are two cars parked in the driveway, and so he can't see what's at the top of the driveway that Kristen is apparently getting ready to draw her gun on. But as he begins running up the driveway, he sees there is this massive 6-foot wide stream of blood just coming down the driveway. And so he goes around the left side of the left car, he goes up and he sees Kristen right at the top of the driveway. She's got her gun aimed at the ground right in front of the car, so he can't see what's in front of the car yet. He comes bombing around the left side right behind Kristen, and he looks down at what she's aiming her gun at, and he sees there's this man lying on the ground, his eyes are open, he's just laying there kind of stiff, and he's looking up at Kristen, and he's looking up at Dan, and he's just quietly saying, please help me. The man on the ground was John Stevens, and on top of John Stevens was Austin. He was kind of laying sideways on John's chest. He had his left arm wrapped around John's neck to kind of hold him in place, and then he had his right arm and he was doing something to John's face. But Dan couldn't really tell what he was doing. All he could take in was there was clearly an aggressor and they needed to get him off of the victim. But Kristen could not take the shot because if she did, she ran the risk of firing the bullet through Austin into John, killing John. And so Dan tells Kristen, hold on, I'm gonna tase him. And so he moves around Kristen to her left side, so he's positioned looking down at the back of Austin. He pulls out his taser, and right before he shoots his taser into Austin's back, he sees what Austin is doing to John's face. With his free right hand, he was reaching into John's mouth and pulling his cheek out, kind of like a fish hook. He was pulling it out as far as he could, and then he was biting into John's cheek, and he was ripping out pieces of flesh and chewing and swallowing them. And from his position, Dan only saw this for a second, but he suddenly noticed, and Kristen, the other officer, would later confirm, there were all these chunks already missing from John's face. And so Dan kind of snapped out of what he was seeing and fired his taser into the back of Austin, but it did nothing. It had absolutely no effect. Austin was entirely focused on biting John's face. That was all he was doing. He wasn't even registering that there were cops with their guns drawn on him. It was like they weren't even there. And so Dan runs back around Kristen to the other side of her. He's now on her right side, so he's standing right next to the car, looking down at Austin's front. And he tells Kristen to kind of back up for a second, and then Dan winds up and kicks Austin square in the face, knocking his head off of John's face. But as soon as Austin comes off of John, he doesn't get up and try to fight with Dan. Instead, he just jumps back down, gets a deeper grip on John, and plunges his mouth back onto John's face. And so again, Dan winds up and boots Austin square in the face, knocking his head back. But again, he's totally unfazed. He doesn't want to attack the officers. He just wants to eat John's face. And so he goes right back down, gets a tighter grip. He goes back and he starts chewing on John's face again. And so Dan was just repeatedly kicking him in the face over and over and over again, right as another set of officers showed up, and they had a canine. They had a dog. And so they come flying up. They kind of see the situation, and Dan tells them, release the dog. And so sure enough, they release the canine. The canine clamps down on Austin's right arm, the arm that was fish hooking and kind of pulling John's face out. And the dog really got a good bite on his arm and yanked it away from John's face. But Austin just instantly ripped his arm back, doing severe damage to his arm from the dog's teeth, and just repositioned himself and went back to biting John's face. And so the dog, just as it was trained, did another bite. It grabbed back onto Austin's arm and it pulled it off of John's body. And so his arm is back like this again. And Austin, again, unfazed, just yanked his arm out of the dog's teeth, again, shredding the muscles of his arm, and gets back in position and continues to eat John's face. And then finally, the dog gets another bite into Austin's arm, and this time when the dog managed to yank Austin's arm away from John, Dan timed it so he booted Austin square in the face right as his arm was being pulled back, and he hit him hard enough that Austin actually flew off of John and landed on his back. And as soon as he was on the ground, Dan actually leapt over John and landed on Austin's face, smashing his head into the cement, which kind of stunned him for a second. And as soon as he was stunned, Dan whipped out his handcuffs, threw it over one of Austin's wrists, and began pulling him by the handcuff up the driveway away from John. But as soon as he had some separation and Dan went to put the other handcuff on Austin, Austin began fighting back, and he looked up at Dan and he screamed, "Kill me! I'm eating humans! Kill me!" Dan didn't even know what to do, and so he's trying to put the other handcuff on him. The whole time Austin is screaming, "Kill me! Kill me!" And so other officers had to run in, and then finally, after 3 other officers came over, they were able to hold Austin down long enough to get both handcuffs on him. After Austin was finally restrained, the officers checked on the victims. They checked on Michelle, who was in the garage, and unfortunately she was deceased. She had died from blunt force trauma. And John, even though he had been alive when the police first showed up, he had succumbed to the multitude of injuries he had sustained, from stabbings to beatings to having a portion of his face ripped off. It's believed after John came back from his walk, which would have been right after Jeff had been attacked and ran back to his house, John saw Austin in his garage attacking his wife, and John ran in to try to save her. And so ultimately John would die trying to save the woman that he loved. Their dog would survive the attack. It was unharmed, and it was given to one of their children to take care of. And Jeff Fisher, the neighbor who tried to save John and Michelle, he would survive the attack and make a full recovery. After Austin was finally handcuffed and was laying restrained on the driveway, he suddenly became unresponsive. He was rushed to the hospital, where it was determined he had drank some poisonous chemicals, most likely from inside of John and Michelle's garage, and that was what was causing his organs to fail. Ultimately, Austin would go into a coma for 11 days from whatever he ingested, but the doctors were able to save his life, and so he would come out of that coma and he would make a full physical recovery. It was initially assumed that because of Austin's drug abuse history, that he must have been on some drug when he perpetrated this heinous crime. It was speculated that he could have been on bath salts or flakka, which are these synthetic hallucinogenic drugs, which are very powerful, and at the time they were quite popular in Florida, and they'd caused some other users to go on these kind of wild, violent rampages. And so it seemed to make a lot of sense that he must have been on one of those. But when Austin's toxicology report finally came back, it showed he only had a very small amount of THC in his system, which is the drug found in marijuana, and then the other drugs that were in his system were all induced by the doctors and nurses at the hospital, which meant at the time of this attack, Austin was effectively sober. When the police asked Austin, "Why did you do this?" he initially said, "I don't remember, I don't know," but eventually he would open up and he would tell this story that no sane person could possibly understand. He said after he left that restaurant where his family was that third time, after he fought with his father and he stormed out, after that, he saw this dark figure outside with a white face. And he knew immediately that this figure was evil. And so instinctively, Austin began running away from this evil figure. And so he ran about 4 miles into John and Michelle's neighborhood. And when he got to this neighborhood, a neighborhood he was not familiar with, that he didn't intend to go to on purpose, he just kind of wound up there. He said he saw this brightly lit up garage and he ran up into it, believing he could enlist the help of the people inside of this house and that they would help him defeat this evil figure that was lurking somewhere nearby. And so he runs up into this garage, which happens to be John and Michelle's garage, and Michelle is in there. John is not. He's out for the walk with his dog, and Austin approaches her and tries to get her to help him, but he probably came off looking completely insane, and Michelle screamed. At which point, Austin said he believed Michelle was a witch, and so he pulled out his knife and he attacked her. And then after she fell to the ground, Austin said he drank a bottle of alcohol or something, which we now know was most likely very poisonous lawn chemicals that was just in the garage. After he drinks that bottle, he turns around and now he's looking out of the garage towards the street. And he said he saw this other figure in the doorway with a dog next to him. And then Austin said his mind just went blank. It's believed the figure he saw in the doorway was John Stevens returning from his walk, but we don't know for sure, and frankly, this story is pretty incoherent to begin with, because it doesn't account for the fact that before John came back, Austin had been grappling with Jeff Fisher and stabbing Jeff Fisher, the neighbor. But Austin would say he has no recollection of encountering Jeff Fisher, he has no recollection of John or what he looked like, and he certainly doesn't remember biting John's face, and he had no memory of any interactions with police. He said that basically he turned around, he sees this figure, this dog, and then his mind went blank, and then he woke up about 2 weeks later in the hospital. Now, when his story went public, a lot of people just were not willing to accept that story. They said he was making it up so he could plead insanity at his trial and get a lesser sentence. But a world-renowned forensic psychologist named Philip Resnick, who had worked on many high-profile cases before, he did a lengthy assessment of Austin, and he came to a very different conclusion than the public. In his 38-page report, Resnick points out the fact that Austin continued to bite John's face even when he was being openly threatened with being shot by the police officer standing right over him. He continued to bite John's face after he was tased. He continued to bite John's face after he was kicked in the head repeatedly. He continued to bite John's face after a dog repeatedly bit him. This all suggests that Austin was truly in a psychotic state when this attack occurred. A sane person, even under the influence of drugs, will retain a basic survival instinct. They will try to protect themselves. So when there are guns pointed at them, or they're being physically harmed, or there's threats of violence, they'll do things to protect themselves. But Austin didn't. It was like he had no idea about anything else except John's face. Resnick specified that the type of psychotic episode that Austin was suffering from on the night of the attack is something called clinical lycanthropy delusions. Clinical lycanthropy is a very rare occurrence where an individual believes they are no longer human. And almost always what they believe they are is something akin to a werewolf. And in Austin's case, it's not that hard to figure out why you might reach that type of conclusion. He had told his sister that he believed he was half horse, and then on a couple other occasions he had told his other friends that he believed he was half dog. And then of course, on the night of the attack, after he killed Michelle, he pounced literally on John and began eating his face while making those loud animalistic grunting sounds. This is behavior that is certainly on par with what you would expect a werewolf to do in a movie. But this was not a movie, this was real life. After Austin came out of his coma, but before he had been transferred to jail, he agreed to do an interview with the clinical psychologist, TV personality Phil McGraw, better known as Dr. Phil. And during their 10-minute Zoom interview, Austin would break down and cry and say he was incredibly sorry to the family of the victims, that he didn't really know why it happened, and that clearly there was something wrong with him and he needed help, and he just hoped they could find it in their hearts to eventually forgive him. But it's unlikely the family of the victims are going to forgive him anytime soon, especially when you consider they came out in an interview and said, "I hope Austin makes a full recovery from his coma, that he has no brain damage, that he is totally A-okay, so he can be fully aware and lucid when they read him his sentence." a sentence they hoped would be the death penalty. As of right now, though, the family of the victims will just have to keep on waiting because Austin is still in jail awaiting trial.